Hey guys, welcome to Priceless B-Movies. I'm your host, Colin Price. Now there's a word that's been on a lot of lips in terms of film in the last 10 to 15 years, and usually not a word that's used in discussions that are, well, very positive, and that word is remake. Remakes have been a big deal for mostly the last 50 or 60 years, but they've been a bigger deal in the last 10 to 15 because there's been more and more and more of them. You've been seeing studios kind of relying on films of the past to make them money. One in particular that a lot of people have been talking about on social media, including myself, is Stephen King's It, which is coming out on September 8th. Now before I go any further, I want to clarify something because I've heard a lot of people call it a remake. It's not. Technically it's an adaptation, it's a film adaptation of the book. To call it a remake would imply that, one, the book never existed, and two, that the film, that the TV miniseries was actually technically a movie, which it wasn't. Because to call the new film a remake would be to say it is a remake of the miniseries, but it's not. Because in those terms, the word remake does not apply. It is technically a separate adaptation in another medium of the book. Getting that out of the way, though, as someone who is a horror movie critic and has reviewed remakes among other movies on his page, the question I get a lot from people is, do you like remakes? Do you not like remakes? What I have to say is, it depends. In all honesty, it depends. With remakes, I'm usually cautiously optimistic, is how I like to put it. I'm cautiously optimistic. There's only been a handful of times where I've refused to see a remake because I was just certain that it would not do for me what the original did. Usually I'm pretty open-minded with remakes. I see storytelling as an art form that transcends time. So if something was really good in the 70s, I see no reason most of the time why modernizing it you wouldn't have a good film if you made it again now. I generally don't have a problem with remakes in that area, but it's just like any other kind of film. You either do it well or you don't do it well. Now, if you want to ask me why I think we're seeing more remakes and reboots these days than we used to, I just have to say that I think studios have kind of discovered that, especially with horror movie remakes, they're cheap to make, and at least with most of them, the nostalgia factor is enough to guarantee AIS, or asses in seats. And that's really the way it is. Studios don't remake movies for the most part because they think that it's necessary to. They do it because it's guaranteed money. Usually when studios, if you figure that for every time a studio loses a couple $1 million on a big budget film, how do you think they make that back? They stay afloat by taking $30 million, or sometimes even less than that, into a Nightmare on Elm Street remake that makes $100 million its theatrical run. It's money. That's why studios are remaking movies more than they used to, because it's a safe bet. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I want to discuss 10 films. 5 of them are horror movie remakes that I enjoy, and 5 of them are horror movie remakes that I think got it wrong. And, with remakes also, because it is such a hot button issue with people, I do not expect everyone to agree with me on these. This is a totally subjective thing, in a lot of ways even more so than just a regular review, because you're coming into this video, watching this video with additional baggage, with what you already think, not only of a remake, but of the original, which probably holds a special place in your heart from your childhood or from whatever. Please rest assured that I am telling you what I think of these films. I am not telling you what I believe you should think of these films. That out of the way, let's get started with 5 horror movie remakes that I really like. Number 5, Night of the Demons, 2009. Obviously, this is a remake of one of my favorite movies of all time, Night of the Demons from 1988. I reviewed this remake a couple of years ago on this page. You can scroll down and look at my review. And I was kind of indifferent to it at the time. There were things I liked about it. There were things I didn't like about it. Generally, the problems that I had with the film was that whenever it tried to emulate or give an homage to the original film, the scene recreations did not work. Kind of the iconic sequences like the lipstick scene and Angela's dance number that are, huge, iconic scenes in the original film were kind of bungled in this. But at the same time, I liked a lot of the changes they made. I liked a lot of the updates that they made. Whereas the original film took place in a supposedly haunted mortuary, and these high school kids just kind of went in there kind of on a dare, like, ooh, let's go have a Halloween party at the supposedly haunted house, and it was this total 80s kitsch thing. The remake, the people are a little older, which justifies, so now at least you don't have people who are in their 20s playing high schoolers, you have people who are in their 20s playing 20-somethings, are at this party, and but it's being held, it's like an event, it's like an actual Halloween party, and there's like over 100 people there, and yada yada, but then it gets shut down until there's only, and a bunch of people are forced to leave, and now there's only so many people in the house. That's when the horror starts. I kind of like changes like that. I also like a lot of the ideas that the demons can control not only the house, but how we perceive things like time. And, a lot of the traps that the demons set for the victims. I think that a lot of the original ideas work really well. But at the same time, you kind of go into a remake wanting the iconic scenes, wanting to relive, and any time that the film tried to emulate those great sequences from the first film, I just don't think any of them were done particularly well. So while I like this film, I don't consider it a great remake, and that's why it's at number 5 and not number 1. Number 4, Carrie. Okay, guys, don't stop. Don't go anywhere. Look, hey, okay. Hey, just hear me out. Just hear me out. Carrie, 2013. A lot of people really had it in for this movie before it even came out. A couple of people I know, some friends, some family members, were big fans of the original 1976 Carrie. I liked it. I didn't think it was anything uber special. I can appreciate how at the time it had a lot of impact, but it was fairly far from the book in the details, and I thought that some of the performances that a lot of people love were actually kind of campy. Piper Laurie I thought was great as the mom, but at the same time, even she's kind of, well, forget kind of, she's really over the top, to the point where even when I was younger, I was laughing at a lot of the things she did, rather than being afraid of her. The remake obviously updates a lot to make it fit into modern times. Some of that stuff worked for me, like the social media, how they cyberbully Carrie to an extent. Like that stuff worked for me, but at the same time, I didn't care for the performances a lot with some of the more mean girls. I just kind of thought that it was very typical in terms of just none of those performances really stood out. What did really get me was Chloe Grace Moretz as Carrie, and especially Julianne Moore, of all people, who I usually don't like in anything really, as Carrie's mom. I thought that at its heart, even with the updates and the changes, that the tone of this movie was closer to the tone of the book. And they even made much more of an effort to be accurate in terms of the ending. The ending of the book and the ending of the movie are much closer than if you were to compare the 1976 film to the book. I recently read, about maybe like 7 or 8 months ago, that originally the remake of Carrie was very different, and the studio kind of panicked and they wanted it to be a little more conventional and a little more like the 1976 film. I think that was a mistake, because I do think that at the heart of the remake, this is closer to the book. This is closer in tone to the book. I do like the performances a bit better, at least from the leads. And I think that the 1976 version isn't overrated. I'm not saying that at all. But it was a product of its time. It doesn't hold up particularly well today. It's very much a 70s horror film. So I like that they took a chance on the remake, and I like that they tried to retell the story to another generation who probably honestly would laugh at the original film. Number 3, 2001 Maniacs, 2005. 2001 Maniacs is a remake of a Herschel Gordon Lewis film, 2000 Maniacs, And I actually saw 2001 Maniacs before I'd seen the original, before I even knew it was a remake. And it was one of those random, I was at Blockbuster and here's Robert Englund looking like Colonel Sanders on the cover of this DVD. And I'm like, okay, there's no way that this can be so bad that it's not at least entertaining. So I pick it up, I take it home. What's really ironic is I say he looks like Colonel Sanders. At the time that I saw this, I was working at KFC. And all of the barbecue jokes and chicken jokes and stuff in this movie. Anyway, to my surprise, I really liked 2001 Maniacs. I liked it enough that I immediately went out to Best Buy and picked up a copy of it for myself. And then about a year and a half later, I was able to find a copy of 2000 Maniacs. Because it's not, I mean, other than Amazon, other than going online, it's not a movie that you're going to find at your local video store. And I gave it a watch, and I was really taken aback. I mean, I get that they had a lower budget back then, extremely low budget, but it seemed more mean-spirited than funny. A lot of the horror and the comedy elements that blend so well in 2001 Maniacs really don't blend at all in the original. The original really does seem more like a generic slasher flick that has a couple of mild attempts at humor than a horror comedy. And I really enjoyed how in the remake, especially with Robert Englund as the mayor of this, fucked up ghost town, that they had a lot of fun with it. Whereas in the original, it is just kind of like, okay, how is this next person going to get bumped off and how sadistic will it be? But at the same time, the humor's not there. At least not to the extent that the remake. And I really think that humor, when you're doing a movie where the plot line is some northerners get stuck in a ghost town left over from the Civil War, and they're killed off by the people in this town in these creative, almost carnival show-esque ways. If you can't have fun with that, what's the point? 2001 Maniacs is definitely a case where I think that the remake is far better than the original film. Number 2, Fright Night, 2011. Now this is one that I almost didn't go to see. When I first heard they were remaking Fright Night, which is like in my top 10 of like the best horror movies, horror comedy films of all time. I'm a huge Fright Night fan. My wife and I have autographs of just about everyone who is in that original film. We love that movie. It's like it's one of those truly iconic horror films from the 80s. It's perfect in almost every way. And when I heard that they were remaking it, and the first bit of news that I heard when I heard Fright Night remake, accompanying that was that Christopher Mintz-Plasse was going to be Evil Ed. And I'm like, they got McLovin playing Evil Ed. And then I thought about it over time, right? And I'm like, you know what? Evil Ed is a nerd in the original film. Maybe that was actually a bit of really good casting. I don't know. Maybe I should kind of keep an eye out for this. And then after a while, the trailers started to drop, and I got a little more excited about it, a little more kind of like, all right, maybe this could be good. And then I went to see it in the theater with a good buddy of mine and loved it. There were a couple of things that I didn't particularly care for, but as far as remakes go, I don't think that a remake of Fright Night would ever be better than the film that we got in 2011. I think that's as good as a remake of Fright Night was ever going to be. And most of the props go to the script for updating it and for kind of the modernized take. A lot of the ideas, like setting it in a Vegas suburb. You know, Vegas, people come and go all the time. So they wouldn't notice disappearances if a vampire was attacking people in the neighborhood. Stuff like that. That's a stroke of brilliance. I thought this had a really smart script. I liked the direction a lot. And I thought that Colin Farrell as the vampire and David Tennant as the updated version of Peter Vincent was just... Both of them were wonderful. Both of them were a lot better than I actually at first thought they were going to be. Fright Night is a remake that takes the original, takes what made the original work, and flies off with it. Now, there are a couple issues I have with it. I do miss the dance sequence from the original film. I wish they had kept some of that kind of romantic subplot in, but I can also understand why they didn't. You know, they were selling a horror film to a crowd that was kind of sick of Twilight and stuff like that, so I can see why they didn't want to go in that direction, but I still think it would have been nice to see. Regardless, Fright Night is an excellent remake. If you haven't seen it yet, you really should. Now, before I get to my number one, I want to list a couple of honorable mentions. Movies that are remakes that I do enjoy, but just didn't make the list. Let Me In. The Ring. The Hitcher. The Crazies. Alright, and my number one favorite remake of all time is House on Haunted Hill, 1999. Of course, House on Haunted Hill, and this is another one like Carrie that I half expect, if you're watching this video, you've probably just turned it off. House on Haunted Hill, the remake, when it came out, was generally panned by critics and only did kind of so-so at the box office. The reason for this is completely beyond me. This is one of my favorite horror movies of any time period. This is one of those few horror movies where I felt personally like everything worked. Did it get campy? Yes, but look at the source material. The original House on Haunted Hill, the Vincent Price film, was extremely campy. But there are some things that bugged me about that film when I first saw it. There were some things that I just thought weren't elaborated on enough, and I did think that, other than Vincent Price, some of the acting was kind of questionable, to say the least. In the remake, I like that they've turned the haunted house into a haunted insane asylum that's been rebuilt into a house. I thought that was cool, because it almost adds to the tension. Like, you're not even just dealing with regular ghosts, you're dealing with the ghosts of crazy people. I thought that was kind of cool. And then the idea that the Vincent Price character in this film he's played by Jeffrey Rush, that he's a little more sleazy. And I think that the dynamic between him and Famke Janssen, who plays his wife, I think that dynamic between those two characters works so much better in this film than in the original film. I just think that this is one of those remakes that overall ups the ante in almost every way from the original. I think this is a perfect remake. It's a movie I've seen over a dozen times, and I don't think I'm ever, at least in the near future, going to get tired of it. I love this movie. I think it's genuinely scary. I think the parts of it are genuinely funny. And I think that the people who kind of pan on it probably either A, when they saw it, they were biased from the get-go because it was a remake of something they grew up watching. Or B, they haven't really seen it. They just went to Rotten Tomatoes, read some of the reviews that were eager to pan it as a slasher film, and just decided, I'm just going to say that I agree with the critics and I'm not going to bother with the movie. Either way, House on Haunted Hill is a wonderful remake. Don't believe the hype. Check it out for yourself. Alright, now we're going to get into the 5 remakes that I don't like. You've heard me talk about 5 remakes that I like. Movies that I think explored on themes or just did things better. Movies that I thought were more effective than the original. Movies that stayed closer to source material than the original film in a lot of ways. For whatever reason, remakes that I thought were either as good as the original film or better. Now we're going to look at some movies that I think are subpar. Movies that I think were aimed at an audience hoping to God that the audience either would never have heard of the original film or that would just be forgiving. Either way, here's 5 horror movie remakes that I really do not like. Number 5, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2003. I remember watching an interview with Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface in the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where he said that he was asked to come and star in the 2003 remake and play Leatherface again. And his initial reaction was, well, why would you remake that? What are you going to add to that makes it as good or better than the original version? Because the original version is very much a product of its time. And they told him, well, here's the thing. We're going to make this much more of a psychological horror film. It's not going to be a bloodbath like the original. And Gunnar Hansen said, bloodbath? Have you seen the original movie? And he's got a really good point there. In a lot of ways, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre from the 70s, is much more of a psychological horror film than a bloodbath. I mean, if you watch that film today, there's not a lot of on-screen gore. Most of the violence, as brutal as it is off-screen, or it's more about mentally and emotionally breaking down the main character than it is physically torturing them. Whereas in the remake, there's gore all over the place, like a sickening amount of bloody violence. You know, my favorite bit is when Leatherface cuts off a guy's leg at the knee, then puts him on a hook, packs salt into the wound, and wraps a bag around it to torture the guy, to keep the salt pressed into his leg. You don't find that kind of excessive torture porn crap in the original film. The original film is very much a brutal psychological thriller, and this movie really just did not even understand why the original worked. It didn't. I will say this, though. Arlie Ermey is a hoot as the sheriff. Number 4, The Haunting, 1999. Here's another great example of a remake that completely missed the point of what made the original so good. The original film, The Haunting, from the 60s, based off a book by Shirley Jackson, that movie is wonderful. Now, it's slow. It is. A lot of the scares come from what you hear and not what you see. The impact of the film, the cinematography in the film, a lot of neat camera tricks that were really kind of innovated with this movie, kind of redefined and showed people what a haunted house movie could be without actually showing a lot of ghosts or a lot of violence or a lot of, you know, it was different at the time, and I can see that people watching it today might be like, oh, this is kind of lame, because the film is over 50 years old. But I think it still stands as a movie that really broke a lot of ground and kind of showed us what a haunted house film could be, kind of set a lot of guidelines for what the modern haunted house film is even today. The remake was all about CG. The remake was all about, let's have CG ghosts, CG house, CG hallways, CG, everything in this movie is CG. It's like someone read the back of the cover of the book, The Haunting, to get a couple of character names and went, how can we make this look like a fucking cartoon? The only thing that's more amazing to me than how bad the remake of The Haunting was that there's 3 movies that are remakes that are worse. Moving on. Moving on. Number 3, Friday the 13th, 2009. I almost think that it's unfair to call this a remake, because all the Friday the 13th movies, at least up until like part 7 or 8, were more or less the same movie. I mean, it's kind of like The Crow. You could argue that, oh, you're going to remake The Crow. Well, what's the difference? You've already done it several times, because the sequels are basically step-by-step the first film, just they're not as good. What interested me initially in seeing the remake of Friday the 13th was when I'd read some interviews with the filmmakers saying how they wanted to reinvent the character in the mythology, and how they were going to spend a lot of time kind of delving deep into the psychology of Jason Voorhees. What we got in the film was a 2 or 3 minute opening sequence of him and the bomb and all this kind of stuff, and then we got a generic Jason movie. Fuck you. The ultimate sin of this film isn't even that, they basically lied to us, promising something innovative and something yada yada. That's not even the worst part. The worst part is the standard slasher film that we get is not even as good, not even as well made as some of the worst of the Jason sequels. This is one of the most generic slasher films I've ever seen. I can't right off the bat think of a kill that was particularly memorable, an actor that was very good, like a performance that stood out. I don't think there's anything that sets this apart from the movie of the week Drek on the Sci-Fi Channel. I really don't. This is a god-awful movie, not just a god-awful remake. At this point, why don't we just start leaving Freddy and Jason alone? How about that? That work for you? Number 2, The Wicker Man, 2006. Otherwise known as one of the 3 movies that completely ruined Nicolas Cage. This movie is, oh my god, where do I start? The original Wicker Man from 1973 is, first of all, it's almost weird to call it a horror film, because it's really only a horror film in very vague terms. It's more like a, how do I put it? You can't even put many genres to it. It's a horror film, it's a thriller, it's a mystery, it's a drama, it's a musical in a lot of ways. And it does have some fairly offbeat comedic sequences. It's kind of hard to put a label on it until you get to that infamous twist ending where you realize that the town is really set against this one character. And then, because of the horrific ending, a lot of people classify it as a horror film. The beauty of the original Wicker Man is that it is so many things. It's hard to put your finger on what genre it is. It's hard to find fault in the performances and the direction, because you're never quite sure where it's going until you get to that ending. The remake decided to play it as a straight horror film, effectively losing the comedic elements, unless you count stuff that's unintentionally funny, and completely losing the air of mystery. We all know how it's going to end if we know the original film. So there's no suspense, and all we're left with is Nicolas Cage ranting and raving and giving one of the worst performances of the last 20 years in anything. And a director who clearly did not even watch the original movie before he set upon making this complete abortion of a horror film. Now, just like I did with the previous 5, before I get to number 1, here are some honorable mentions. Sorry, some dishonorable mentions. Pulse. Shudder. 13 Ghosts. Alright, and my number 1 pick for what I feel personally is the worst horror movie remake that I have seen, Evil Dead, 2013. Man, it's amazing to me the number of people that like this movie, because whenever I talk to someone who really likes the remake of Evil Dead, the more and more I talk to them, the more and more it becomes apparent that they either never saw the original film, or that they've seen it, but they don't understand what was so great about it, which is that it was a lower budget film. A lot of the campiness, a lot of what makes that film memorable is what it accomplished in terms of horror and comedy with such a low budget. When I saw the remake, I thought the first 5 minutes, that great sequence where the girl's running and the guys capture her, they tie her up, and you think, oh, they're monsters, they're yada yada, and then it turns out that she is the one possessed by the demon, that was cool. That is the one thing I will give this movie. That intro was great. And then the rest of the movie happened. And now what we have is a straight torture porn film in this cabin with the dumbest fucking characters you've ever seen in a horror film, doing dumb things, staying alive well past the point that any real person would be dead, and all the humor is gone. This is a straight torture porn horror film with little originality and little to separate it, and what's worse, it doesn't even follow its own rules. I'm okay when a remake kind of changes the rules of the original, as long as it follows them. Like the Night of the Demons remake, it changed some of the rules, but it stuck to the changes that it made. In this film, if I'm remembering correctly, because it's been a few years, so many souls have to be sacrificed for this thing, this abomination, to come forth. It technically doesn't get the number of souls that it needs, but for the sake of the ending, the monster's still going to come. And the monster isn't even going to be a monster. It's just going to be this pale version of the main character. This is really dumb. This is really, really dumb. This is an insult to anyone who really loves the original film. And the prime example of what not to do when remaking a movie. Other than the first 5 minutes, there is not a single thing in Evil Dead that works as a remake, as an interesting film, as an entertaining film. This is a complete abortion. And you know what? Everyone's like, oh, it was so good that they did a TV show. No. It was so bad that they abandoned their plans for future sequels. You see, yeah, the movie made money and got some good reviews, But the naysayers, the people who didn't like the movie, who got why it was bad, spoke out. And the studio realized if they stayed along the same lines of what they did in the first remake, they were going to lose their audience. So they reinvented it, and now we have Ash versus the Evil Dead. Now I have yada yada. This remake, one of the worst horror films I've ever seen. Sorry. Not sorry. So that's my opinion on remakes in general, and 5 remakes that I really like, 5 remakes that I really don't like. I hope that this has been at least somewhat enlightening to people. I know that, as I said before, everyone kind of has different opinions on what makes a good remake, what makes a good horror film in general, but I hope that I've at least expressed in a way that everyone can appreciate what I think constitutes a good remake, what I think makes a remake worth making. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more Priceless B movies.